Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show and the second of our series on the issue of violence in the communities of London. This national crisis has dominated the headlines in recent months, one of the few issues to break through the Brexit domination of the media. In last week's show, we examined the politicians' reaction to rising levels of knife crime. This is how the London Mayor's Office responded.
A spokesperson for the Mayor of London said, "The Mayor has established England's first violence reduction unit in London, bringing together local councils, the health service, community groups and others to work on a shared approach to preventing people from turning to violent crime in the first place. We know the causes of violent crime are complex, involve deep-seated problems, all of which is made worse by government cuts to the police and preventative services. We are working hard to challenge the perception it is safe to carry a knife, and the Violence Reduction Unit will seek to better understand where to make positive early interventions." City Hall drew on the expertise from Scotland when developing the Violence Reduction Unit for London, and senior representatives from Scotland's Violence Reduction Unit are included in the Partnership Reference Group.
Thus, the London Mayor, the Home Secretary and campaigners across the board have now seized on the public health approach to knife crime, pioneered in Scotland more than a decade ago. So this week, we asked the former Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny McCaskill what these lessons really are and whether they can be applied south of the border.
The Mayor and indeed the Home Secretary can recognise that the underlying solutions need addressed, equally balance it with the public reassurance that London can get through this, but they've got to address the underlying reasons, and equally they've also got to be able to give reassurance to young people who are frightened at the moment that they'll be protected, that a policeman will be there to make sure that the person who might use a knife will be detected.
But first, your tweets, messages and emails in response to last week's show. Alistair says, "Is anyone keeping count of the number of Scottish initiatives that have since been copied by Westminster or the Labour Party?" I have no idea. Maybe you could start, Alistair. It's a good idea. Faye says, "Really enjoyed this episode. What an inspiration Prince is. Dr. Mark Prince OB most certainly was." Jim Mack says, "Once again, tackling issues bereft of Westminster. What a cracking show." Gordon Mackenzie, who also speaks of Dr. Mark Prince's story and the loss of his son, says, "Fabulous as always, but Dr. Mark Prince, that was so personal and touching. Not for the first time watching your show, I was deeply moved by his story. The authorities in London seem very reluctant to take advice or listen to anybody though, which is very sad, if not arrogant." Finally, Donald says, "Stop and search randomly at school entrances and major events will help." He also suggests an on-the-spot community service of 200 hours for any first offence. Thank you all very much for your tweets and emails. Now, the Home Secretary's speech in East London last week was his first on crime. His commitment to move to a public health approach has received a cautious welcome across the political parties.
The public health approach, which is something I announced towards the end of last year, and that again was through listening to experience from both other parts of the UK, from other countries as well, who have also seen a similar rise in serious violence. And I think we should learn from wherever we can, and I think it is important to have such an approach which requires all government departments, all agencies of government to treat serious violence as the way we would treat, for example, a disease, to prioritise it and to make it a statutory duty.
And underpinning the cross-government effort that he mentioned has to be a public health approach to tackle the root causes of violence. This is something we thought the government favoured too, encompassing looking at youth services, school exclusions, housing, social services, mental health and health as a whole.
We're acutely aware of the problem of knife crime in Scotland because until recent years it was a terrible scourge, but as others have alluded to, as a result of a radical change of approach to the problem, the incidence of knife crime in Scotland has greatly reduced, and crimes of handling an offensive weapon have decreased by 64% between the years 2007-2008 and 2016-2017. And as I think we all know now, this occurred because of a holistic approach which involved the creation of a violence reduction unit, initially in Glasgow and now for the whole of Scotland, funded by the Scottish Government, which treats violent crime as a public health problem and a social problem. Too many children with multiple ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, are excluded from school, which in turn can lead them to become involved in gangs and violence. If we are to tackle this epidemic of youth violence, we need an approach, whether you call it public health, but we need an approach which is trauma-informed, i.e. care for children with ACEs.
The public health, public education approach is right, together with more police officers. But wasn't the former Metropolitan Police Commissioner correct this morning when he said that ultimately our young people need to know that they're better off not being in possession of a knife than having that knife? And therefore, isn't it also time for us to have clearer mandatory sentencing for those caught in possession of a knife without just cause?
We must all acknowledge that this is an issue that transcends party lines. Politics can be divisive, but if there was ever an issue to unite our efforts and inspire us to stand together, then surely this is it.
So there is now a growing consensus that this new approach, modelled on the Scottish experience, is the way to move forward. But will this make the difference that many hope for? Alex turned to Kenny McCaskill, Scottish Justice Secretary from 2007 to 2014, who presided over the historic decline in knife crime in Scotland.
Kenny McCaskill, welcome to the Alex Salmond Show. Now, Kenny, as the knife crime crisis has escalated in London and elsewhere in England, there's been a lot of calls to adopt the Scottish system, sometimes called the Glasgow system. You must have an element of pride amid this crisis that people are looking north for a solution.
Well, I think so, because it was a crisis, but I think Scotland can hold its head high and individuals deserve great credit. John Carnahan, Karen McCluskey.
These were people who were instrumental in the violence reduction unit. Police officers.
Police officers, and it broadened out into medics against violence. And I think the lessons that we learned in Scotland are being looked at sensibly, I think, down here in England, both by the Mayor, now by the Home Secretary, that it has to be dealt with in terms of a longer-term strategy. But I think they also have to remember that they have to balance it with some immediate action to reassure those who are concerned about it.
You saw the Home Secretary's much billed speech last week. What was your initial reaction to what he had to say?
Well, I think I welcome it. I think it's where, to be fair, the Mayor of London had gone before, whether you call it infection, whether you call it a disease, whether you call it a culture. Young people in particular, as happened in Scotland over a decade ago, were carrying knives. They were doing so routinely, and I remember we used to say that it was almost becoming an apparel, as well as, you know, getting your jacket, you would get your knife before you went out. So you've got to break that culture. And there's no one simple solution, there's not one simple way, it's across the board. But I think recognising that there's an underlying issue has been taken on board, and that's correct.
So what exactly is this Scottish approach, which the Home Secretary, which the Mayor of London, which many people in England are saying we must adopt?
Well, I think the Scottish approach was actually threefold. First of all, there was the public health approach, that there was a culture, a disease of violence, and we had to address that. That had to be dealt with by education. We had organisations, Medics Against Violence, telling young people, you know, that a knife isn't a defensive weapon, there's no safe way to use a knife. Equally, we had to work out, why are young people carrying knives? And I think it's the same in London. Why are they carrying it? A small minority are doing so because of bad or of evil intent. Some do because it's machismo. But the overwhelming majority in London now, I believe, as they were in Scotland, carried it because they were scared. They were scared that somebody else was carrying a knife. Now you can threaten them with jail. In Scotland, the opposition wanted 6 months, then they wanted 2 years. But these young people were scared of getting caught. But they were more scared that before they would get caught, they would run into a gang or some other young person and they would die. So they were carrying a knife for their own personal protection. So as well as reassuring them a knife wasn't a defensive weapon, we required to assure them that other people weren't carrying knives.
And how did you do that?
We did it in two ways. One was to do the education about not carrying a knife, but other was to reassure them that actually people who did carry a knife were going to get caught and the punishment would be severe. And that's why I think sometimes people look at the Scottish method that was applied and forget that there was a pretty big stick, as well as a lot of the carrot dealing with underlying diseases. There was an awful lot of stop and search, and that's much more problematic in London, I realise, because of the nature and scale of the city. But there was an awful lot of stop and search because we had to reassure youngsters that those who carried a knife were going to get caught. On a Friday, Saturday night, buses going into the city centre of Glasgow were getting stopped by the police. People were getting frisked and searched. Ferroguard poles had been developed, I remember, to find submarines, but were used at railway stations and bus stations. So if you walked past, they were mobile metal detectors. People were getting stopped and searched because we had to, as well as educate people, don't use a knife. It's not about protecting yourself. You can't do that. It was also about saying those who do carry will get caught. So there was an awful lot of high visibility policing to provide that immediate reassurance. So I think the Home Secretary and the Mayor are on the right track in terms of the underlying long-term approach. But you've also got to have some immediate action to reassure the public, not just the public, but to reassure these youngsters who are scared and who are carrying knives, not because they want to use them, but because they're frightened that one will be used on them and they make the foolish decision that they'll carry one themselves.
Now, some of those who say, well, you can't just transport a Scottish solution into London. I saw a retired police officer make the point. He actually said that Glasgow was a homogeneous city, which will be a surprise to the, I think he meant ethnic terms, which will be a surprise to the people of Glasgow, incidentally. But there has obviously been a lot of controversy around stop and search in London in terms of racial profiling. How would, if you were giving advice to the Mayor and the Home Secretary, how do they address that?
Well, I think, I would be having a word with the Deputy Commissioner Steve House. As I say, he did a remarkable job having come up from London to Glasgow, sorted it out, and he's now back here in London, and he'll be much the wiser and better for his experiences in Scotland. I think it's fair to say that, yes, you can't take the model that was in Glasgow and immediately put it in and think it will fit in London. It's two different contexts. But the general underlying direction of travel, I think, has been recognised. So as I say, I think there's that recognition. There's an understanding. You've got to work out why are knives being carried? What is the solution? You've got to have some political courage. You've got to have some time, and by that, but you've also got to have some enforcement to be able to deliver it. So as I say, I think the Home Secretary, what I would say to him, I think he's on the right track in recognising the underlying causes. I do think he's got to give public reassurance, not just, as I say, to wider communities that are frightened, but to youngsters who are going out tonight and who are maybe worried, to reassure them that they don't need to carry a knife, because those who are going to carry a knife will get caught. And that's actually back to a visible police presence. There are difficulties about stop and search in London. It has to be used in a method that's acceptable, but you have to provide reassurance to young people that those who are carrying are going to get caught, and there have to be consequences for those who are caught. So you've got to get that balance right. Random stop and search isn't going to work, except, as I say, in providing some immediate reassurance, but some targeting, some understanding of providing reassurance, not, as I say, to those who are bad, but to those who are foolish, that they don't need to, because those who are evil will get caught.
Coming up after the break, our interview with Kenny McCaskill continues. He warns London politicians that the public health approach to knife crime has to be balanced with tough measures to be successful. Welcome back. Across the political parties, with substantial support from community activists, there is a move to learn lessons from Scotland to tackle knife crime in London. Let us return to the interview with Kenny McCaskill, where he cautions on expecting immediate progress.
Let me take you back to 2008, where you're Justice Secretary and just in for a year. You've got basically what's been happening in England now. You've got screaming press headlines. You've got tragedy after tragedy. The number of fatalities from knives in Scotland, I think, reached a peak in that year. You've got distressed families coming to see you in their grief and demanding action. You've got opposition politicians saying, junk this social work approach and get stuck into prison sentences and the rest of it. How did you deal with that situation as a Justice Secretary?
Well, I think London, as well as learning lessons from the wider public health approach that thankfully is being dealt with now, they should also look at the new Deputy Commissioner they've got in Steve House, because he was the Chief Constable of Strathclyde, then our largest single area and biggest police force, and where it was the epicentre of knife crime. And you're right, it was a real crisis, because it seemed, certainly as the Justice Secretary, almost every week, or at least once a month, some young man from a good background, a lovely young man with his life in front of him, was slain. And there was uproar and outrage, and understandably, so action had to be taken. And I think the great credit of Steve House, of the judiciary, of the Violence Reduction Unit, was we held the line. Because to be able to implement what is now successfully being looked at, we also had to be able to react. And as happens at every crisis, whether it's a terrorist atrocity or whatever, you had to also give public reassurance. That meant high visibility policing. It did mean that the people were out, the police were out there on the streets, being seen, shown to take action, not just to reassure the good citizens, but also to deter those scared young men who might otherwise have taken a knife, not to take that knife because the police were there and there would be consequences.
But you did also increase the penalties for knife carrying, didn't you?
Oh, knife carrying went up. What actually happened was that the sentences got longer, even although we didn't go for mandatory sentencing. It was a Dutch auction, I think, at one stage. The Tories wanted 2-year mandatory sentence simply for carrying a knife. Labour wanted 6 months. And we knew that what would happen if we did that was that silly, frightened youngsters who weren't bad would end up going to prison and would come out worse. And having been a defence lawyer before I went into politics, I knew that youngsters who weren't bad kids would go into young offenders institutes and would come out knowing how to steal every car in the car park because of what they picked up. So we held the line. Those who needed to, we continued to give the judiciary the discretion. If somebody had to go to jail for a very long time because there, by the grace of God, we'd caught them carrying a knife before they'd done anything, then they got the powers to do that, and our full support. Those who were stupid had the fear of death put in them by a sheriff, but they were let off with a community sentence to do some hard labour in the community, but not to go to jail. So we got, I think, the balance right. That's what the judiciary wanted. It was what the police wanted. Lock up the ones you need to lock up. Don't lock up the ones you don't want to make worse.
And this came to a head at this political battle in the Parliament in the 2011 election, where something very curious happened when you assumed that the person who's got the hardest line policy succeeds. Something very different happened in that election.
Well, we were remarkably successful. You led us into the majority government that was delivered in 2011. I think what it did was it began to resonate. By 2011, it was beginning to decrease. People were seeing that we were working our way through it. And I think you found that, when you put forward a sensible policy, good people stand with you. And the policy was supported, by police, it was supported by the judiciary, it was supported by youth and community workers, it was supported across the board by those on the front line who knew this is sensible, this is what worked. And I always liked when John Carnochan or Steve House with their uniforms on would go out and speak. That mattered much more than a politician. The people who were making the attacks on the government were those politicians with short-term, simplistic demands. Lock them up, do this. We now have simplistic solutions being suggested in London, GPS trafficking and knives, all these absurdities. Life has to go on. So the method of, we had analysed what needed done, we'd shown that it was working, and we persevered. And I think in London, if, the Mayor and indeed the Home Secretary can recognise that the underlying solutions need addressed, equally balance it with the public reassurance, then London can get through this. But they've got to address the underlying reasons, and equally, they've also got to be able to give reassurance to young people who are frightened at the moment that they'll be protected, that a policeman will be there to make sure that the person who might use a knife will be detected.
But it's not exactly a case closed in Scotland. I mean, some of the recent indications are, the reductions have been dramatic. The reductions 60, 70% in knife carrying and fatalities. But recently, the last couple of years, some of the figures starting to edge back up again. How worried are you that having cracked the case, we're now maybe in line for some future tragedies?
Well, I think it would be, wise in Scotland not to rest on our laurels. Great credit, is owed to those individuals and all those organisations. But I think you're right, the trend does tend to be creeping up again. Some of these things are cultural, some of it comes because people are copycat and see things on the TV or whatever. And as I say, sometimes it just gets out of the psyche and the mind of youngsters. So you've got to be ever vigilant. Stop and search is a tactic in the visible police presence. I think it's something that has to be calibrated. You've got to ramp it up at times and you've got to decrease it at other times. And it may be in Scotland that we've gone too far one way, as in London they've gone too far the other, and it may be that we've got to increase it slightly just to provide that reassurance. It's not about policemen having nothing else to do, it's about youngsters feeling that they can be reassured that those carrying knives will be caught, so they don't need to carry a knife.
And how about the other differences between north and south of the border? I mean, the Scotland police numbers have been maintained at very high levels. In England, famously under the direction of the now Prime Minister, then Home Secretary, police numbers were reduced substantially. How big a factor is actual police numbers in being able to produce a visible police presence?
I think it's a huge factor. I mean, community policing is what it's all about. It comes back to the point we were discussing earlier. To provide that reassurance to youngsters, you have to give them the reassurance that those who are going to carry a knife are going to get caught. That's got to come about from a visible policing. How you do it is for the local officers to describe, but they've got to, as I say, be there, because if they're not there, then they're never going to be able to target, let alone stop and search, those who are carrying.
The reason, above all, that stop and search has reduced, I think, from 1 million stop and searches in London alone a year to about a quarter of that figure, was the very heavy pressure from the BME communities, the ethnic minority communities, who felt they were being targeted unfairly. So how do you approach a question from a London point of view, where clearly certain communities, deprived communities, have a prevalence of knife violence? These also may be the communities which have a disproportionate or large number of BME minority communities. So how do you manage to target these communities in order to make them safer without the consequence of people in these communities feeling they're being unfairly picked upon by the police?
I think the only solution is that the police have to sit down with the communities. Because I remember discussions in hard-pressed housing schemes where it was youngsters there, not in leafy suburbs in Edinburgh, who were being stopped and searched, where youngsters would say they didn't mind because the police did it in a manner that was fair. They told them what they were doing and why they were doing it. They didn't like it, I'm not suggesting that they did, but they could see why it was being done to provide that safety.
And as Justice Secretary in Scotland, because they were trying, and still are, a variety of initiatives under that underlying message, what was the most surprising initiative that was presented to you? Did it say, Justice Secretary, we're about to do X, and you thought, what?
Well, there's always some thing. I remember, going out in Greenock, which was an area blighted by knife carrying and knife crime. But it was very effective because we thought and did things that were remarkably what would work with youngsters. Because I have to say, what I initially thought with youngsters, we'll get in pop stars and we'll get in footballers. And I said, I know quite a few, I know the Proclaimers and I know a lot of football players and all these, and we'll get them out. And actually all our evidence showed that the youngsters that we really needed to target, they lived in a different world. None of that mattered. The only people that mattered to them was when they were 12 or 13, who had been the king of the walk or whatever at that time. And it was getting back ex-offenders.
Leader of the local gang?
The leader of the local gang. Getting back those who they had looked up to. We might wonder why they looked up to them, but that's who they looked up to. Rock stars and footballers lived in a parallel universe to them. And actually what worked was getting back the ex-offenders, coming back into saying, these were the ones they admired, who said, I've been there, done it, got the T-shirt, you don't want to go there. That was the only thing that worked. And there were some things that were really hard as well. I remember we had chalk outlines of bodies at schools and community centres that were quite poignant. And indeed, the best advert I ever saw that was in cinemas and we showed in schools, because we knew that young men, as on the road, think they're immortal. But I remember we had an advert which was just the mortician, if I can put it that way, with a cadaver, turning around to say that he was there patched up so that they could see their mum. Because the research showed that these young men, they worried about their mum. They worried that mum would worry if they got stabbed and killed. And they worried about their mum if they stabbed somebody and were going to jail. They worried about their mum. They thought they would always be immortal, but they worried about their mum. So as I say, it's about targeting that message. Targeting and realising that the hardcore youngsters, it's not celebrities. They live in a world where celebrities live in a different universe, but they do recognise the person that they think was the major star was the hard man, as we would call it in Scotland, the gangster. And if you can get those ones back, and we still do that peer mentoring, those ones who have been there, been in prison, come back and say, you don't want to go there. That works remarkably well. So as I say, look back, and I laugh at my naivety, because I did think, we'll roll out the celebrities, we'll put them in. It's a waste of time.
A lot of people say that, look, this is all connected with gang violence, but some of the statistics in Scotland didn't support the idea that the majority of knife crime was coming from gang fights.
No, the majority of knife crime was coming from youngsters just packing it as they would, put their belt on or, put their favourite jacket on. It just became something that you had to do. You were going out. Some did so simply because they were scared, others because they thought it looked cool. But it was, as I say, it became a random apparel, which is why we managed to get drops of 67% in the areas of North Glasgow, 68% I think it was in Greenock.
These were drops in knife crime,
possession
carrying
of offensive weapons, because it was becoming standardised and routine, and it's ending that. People will always carry weapons, because there's always in the world in which we live going to be people of evil intent who are going to use knives maliciously. They have to be targeted by the police. What we need to do is to stop those who don't want to carry it in the first place and only do so because they're frightened.
Finally, Ken McCaskill, as the former Scottish Justice Secretary who presided over what is now generally acknowledged as being an extraordinary success in violence reduction, in the reduction in the carrying of knives, and obviously the reduction in fatalities. Have you got a message of hope for the Mayor of London, for the Home Secretary as they embark on this journey?
Yeah, I think it's a journey. You're right, and I was fortunate to be in a position in journey when we went well. So I think hold your nerve, build that coalition, and you'll get through it. There will be bumps, but if you have the analysis, stick to the plan, you can address it.
Ken McCaskill, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And so the lessons from Scotland seem pretty clear and pretty decisive. But if the Home Secretary's new approach to knife crime, the public health approach copied from north of the border, is to have any impact, then it has to reach communities such as this in Camberwell in South London. The local hospital, King's College, is a few minutes down the road from where I'm standing. Last year alone, in accident and emergency, it treated more than 500 young people, 40% of them young women, for stab wounds or other serious injuries. That's the level of violence going on in this community. Will the public health approach offer the possibility of a substantial reduction? The message from Scotland is it has to be persevered with. And next week on the Alex Salmond Show, I speak to 3 young men from communities such as this who've actually turned their lives around. And I ask whether their personal lesson has any lessons for the wider community. And so from myself and Taz and everyone at the show, it's goodbye for now.